Hi all. It is great to see you all. Or see many of you anyway. Um, I am delighted to welcome you. And this today is the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. So it's a wonderful anniversary of a wonderful day in American history. And again, a shout out to all of you who are really out there trying to make democracy live and breathe these days. I'm also delighted to introduce Marshall Ganz and Anjali Rodriguez, who are going to be our speakers today. We're going to do somewhat different format today. Marshall and Anjali are going to take the entire 40 minutes and they will both speak and do some things that are interactive with you. And then at 5:45, Anjali will lead a training with all the participants in the program. So I'm delighted to introduce Marshall, who is a longtime colleague and a friend and someone who teaches at the Kennedy School and is a beloved teacher at the Kennedy School and a wonderful mentor to many students at the Kennedy School. He worked for 16 years for the United Farm Workers. He has vast community organizing experience, but since coming to the Kennedy School, he's been an inspiring leader nationwide on community organizing and just a really thoughtful and articulate voice on this topic. So I'm delighted to have him. Anjali is a high school teacher, also has a great deal of community organizing experience and works with Marshall. So Anjali, it is a real pleasure to have you as well. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, so what we were asked to share with you is some insights from the world of community organizing, social movement organizing that may be of value to you. We'll see. I hope so. It's an extraordinary time to be doing this. My old friend Tom Hayden once said, change is slow except when it's fast. This is a fast moment. It's extraordinary. I've been on the planet for a while and not experienced anything like this. The simultaneity of it and the global character of it is really extraordinary. And it makes it both a time of terrible challenge and threat and loss, but also a possibility and also of opportunity. And the big question is what we make of these challenges that we're dealing with. You know, we work with mayors, we did a session with them last week who, boy, they're right in the middle, like everything lands in their lap. But I think the deal is to see it as a learning opportunity, a chance to try things, a demand for creativity, and a real moment for leadership. So I'm going to frame what we're saying in the context of leadership and organizing as a form of leadership. But I want to explain what I mean by leadership because that word is used many, many different ways. My approach is based on three questions posed by a first century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who when asked, how do I figure out what to do with my life, responded with three questions to ask yourself. And the first one, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? It's not meant to be selfish. It's meant to be self-regarding. In other words, if you presume to accept responsibility for working with others, you better be clear about what you bring to it, expect from it, so you have the self-awareness to actually be able to see others. And that's his second question is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a human being, and not a what, a thing, is to recognize that we exist in relationship in the world, that our capacity to realize our goals is inevitably wrapped up in the capacity of others. We are relational creatures, and that's how we make meaning, and that's how we live. And the third question then he says to ask yourself is, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic. It's a caution against what Jane Addams called the snare of preparation. Just another degree, and I'll have all the answers the world needs, and then I'll go out and be the source of answers. Or just another year of strategic planning. We'll have a perfect plan. Then the world will totally conform with our plan, except it never works like that. It never works like that because you can't predict the future. And so the point is that rarely can you learn to do well what you want to do until you actually begin to do it. In other words, that understanding flows from action. It's not prior to action. And it means that you're in a learning mode all the time. Now, if it's a leadership question, then it's sort of, well, why would you have leadership? What's it for? And I don't know if you've had experience in your organizations that, or in your experience, everything's going really great and people ask, where's the leadership so we can thank them? Usually when people say, who's in charge here? What's going on? It's usually a problem, it's a contradiction, it's a surprise, it's a dilemma. And what it means is that when things are fine, when the system is working fine, what do you need leadership for? It's when the problems come, that's where the adaptive and creative work of leadership is involved. That's where it is. And that could be daunting to say, okay, I'm accepting a role in which everything's going to be surprises, challenging, or not everything, but a lot of things. And so, you ask yourself, do I have the skills I need to do this? And that's a challenge to the hands. Can I use my resources in new ways? That's a strategic challenge, a challenge to the head. And where do I get the courage? Where do I get the hope? How do I inspire the hope and courage in others to take the risks that are often involved in dealing with challenges in a real way? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's a way of thinking of leadership in a head, hands, heart kind of way. So the definition that we've come to use is that leadership is about accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. This is not leader as diva. This is not leader as the sun that illuminates everyone with its light or burns them or whatever it is. It's leadership as a form of social interaction around the accomplishment of shared purpose. In that sense, it's a very different way of thinking about it. And thinking about it this way, it distinguishes position from practice. In other words, there's a lot of people who occupy positions of formal authority that I think we'd agree are offering pretty terrible leadership. If you can think of any examples of that that might have happened in the last 5 minutes. On the other hand, we meet people in schools, in neighborhoods, at kitchen tables, who are exercising leadership in the way I'm describing it all the time, accepting responsibility for enabling others to accomplish shared purpose. So that's the distinction, or one distinction. Now, organizing is a particular form of leadership, and it's a form of leadership that asks first, who are my people? In other words, who are the people with whom I'm entering into relationship about the accomplishment of a common purpose? So it's not what is my issue, it's who are my people. That's the central question. And then the next question is, what is the change they need and want in terms of their lived experience, in terms of what change would look like to them, not in terms of some theoretical, day. I love the Montgomery bus boycott. I'll say a little bit more about it because it was so concrete what people were fighting for that began to develop the power they needed to deal with the much bigger things. So that's the thing. What kind of change do we need? And then thirdly, how can I enable them to turn their resources into the power that they need in order to accomplish that change? So it's not about providing services to customers, or to clients, which is fine, but it's not organizing. It's not about marketing products to customers, fine too, not organizing. It's not even about advocating for others, because that's not organizing either. Organizing is about equipping people with the tools, the power, the capacity to advocate for themselves. And that's kind of at the heart of what it's about. Now, let's see, next slide. Yes, and the core idea here is in organizing, what you're doing is trying to build constituency. Now, what I mean by that, it comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. And the idea is it's a way of trying to bring people together, to learn together, to decide together, to act together, and hopefully to win together. It is about creating collective capacity, not just adding up a lot of individual emails, but creating fresh collective capacity, because that's how the power is built. And organizing is about power. And that word, sometimes people don't like that word, but Dr. King called it the ability to achieve purpose, or in Spanish, poder means being able to. And it's kind of intuitive, because if you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? Point to yourself or point to me. You need what I've got more than I need what you've got. Who's got the power? Point to yourself, point to me. Come on. You need what I've got more than I need what you've got. I see a finger coming my way. Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. And if it's flipped, then who's got the power? I need what you've got more than you need what I've got. See, it's an intuitive understanding that power is not a thing, it's a relationship. It's a relationship between need and resource. And once you sort of understand that, then you get that you can build power with others through collaboration, but sometimes you have to figure out how to exercise power over those who hold resources that give them power over you. And so, you know, sometimes you can have a credit union, but sometimes you need to, well, there's a saying in Spanish, al nopal no se viene a ver solo cuando tiene tuna, which means people don't come to look at the prickly pear cactus except when it's bearing fruit, which tends to be just before elections when the politicians all show up, because there is something of value there that they need. So organizing is about that. Now, and the way that we approach it is organizing as being, it's about developing leadership, building community around leadership, and building power from community. The way, one of the ways we've learned to teach that and practice it is these 5 practices. So again, it's leadership as not who you are, but what you do. And it's leadership not necessarily one person, but it can be a collective, it can be a collaborative arrangement, because there are pieces of work that need to be done. One is motivating. That's the work of storytelling. Storytelling is about how to translate the emotional resources embedded in our values as sources of solidarity, sources of courage, sources of hope. Building relationships, intentional relationships, including relationships with people that we may not like. In other words, public relationships that are based on respect much more than based on liking. That's sort of a foundation of the whole democratic project, is building relationships. As de Tocqueville argued about the United States, it's in association with others that we figure out what our common interests are, that we develop the emotional bonds that facilitate solidarity, that we can actually learn how to work together. The third is structure. And I say the word structure and everybody's scared. Oh no, we don't want structure. Structure is simply the commitments we make to one another about how we're going to work together. That's what it is. They're commitments we make to each other. We're going to do it this way, we're going to do it that way. And, you know, it gets a bad rap because it's often associated with one person trying to tell everybody what to do. And so sometimes we react to that by saying, well, we don't want any structure, we're all equal here. And then we fall into what Joe Freeman, a feminist sociologist, calls the tyranny of structurelessness. And see, because her point is human beings are going to form structure whenever they get together. It's either going to be on the books, visible, transparent, or it's going to be off the books where we don't know who's deciding what, and we don't know what's going on, and there's factions, and I think you know what I'm talking about. So we are learning a leadership team, or a collaborative and distributed approach to leadership structure. Strategy is turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. Just like storytelling and relationship building, these are things we do in our everyday lives. We strategize every day, we tell stories every day, we build relationships. So a lot of this is about taking what we know how to do implicitly and making it explicit so you can do it with craft and with intentionality. And finally is action, actually changing reality on the ground, whether it's in the form of votes or in the forms of people, conditions, legislation, or whatever it might be. Now, I want to take a few minutes then. Anjali, how much time do I have? Oh, I'm sorry. This is, yeah. I wanted to just illustrate what I'm talking about. This is a problem. Next slide. This is a problem. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, because that happens. I don't know if you've ever been a dot or tried to work with a dot where everything comes to you and nothing can happen without, or everything's got to go to this one person and nothing can happen without that, it's pretty problematic. And I don't think it's power hunger. I think it's wanting to get it right and not trusting in a way. So sometimes the reaction is what I was describing. Next slide. Yeah, no, we don't have any structure. Then it goes all over. Next slide. So what we've been working with is how to develop leadership teams, a collaborative leadership structure that then in which each person can develop their own team and each one can develop their own team, like is illustrated right here, I think. Yeah, there. And then the next tier out there. And that's a distributed leadership model. In other words, it's being leadership rich, not leadership poor, but it means actually doing the work to develop leadership, which is the fundamental practice involved in organizing, because it's through the exercise of leadership that collective purpose can be accomplished. Are we done with the slides? Yeah, okay, that's the reprise. All right, now, Anjali, how much time do I have?
You have 11 minutes.
Okay, all right. And then there's time for after, right?
And then we have 10 minutes for our...
Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, we're sort of racing through that. I'm sorry that the time is so short because, well, anyway. No, I wanted to say a little bit about where this approach comes from and that I was just describing. I was introduced, organizing's been around for a while. I mean, one source, I think one tradition certainly is kind of a faith tradition that begins with stories of people trying to free themselves from slavery and trying to find their way to a land of promise, the Exodus story. Another source is when the Greeks decided they didn't need kings, that they could govern themselves. That's a civic tradition. And then there's the ways people have simply found to use their resources to assert their power, the way Irish tenant farmers did when their British landlord would not make repairs on the farms. They withheld the products until he did, and his name was Captain Boycott. And that's where we get the idea of a boycott, ways in which we can use our resources to generate our own power to exercise with respect to others. So I was introduced to this tradition when I was a junior at Harvard College and volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project, which was an effort to bring students from the North to support the work of African-American organizers in Mississippi who were getting beaten or jailed or worse when they were trying to register voters and break down the barriers to political liberty. And our idea was we were supposed to go there and organize something called the Freedom Democratic Party, a integrated challenge to the racist and segregated Democratic Party, and go to the Democratic Convention and challenge them. That was our task. We were being trained in a place called Oxford, Ohio. It was about 300 of us, and we got word that 3 of our party had disappeared. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. They had gone a week before and gone to investigate the burning of a Black church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and hadn't been heard from since. Bob Moses, who was the lead organizer, called us together and informed us of what had happened. He said, "We heard what happened to our brothers. We don't know exactly what happened, but we think they're gone." And sure enough, in 2 months, their bullet-riddled, beaten bodies were found buried in a dirt levee where the Ku Klux Klan had taken them after executing them when the county sheriff had turned them over to them. Now, we didn't know that, but we kind of knew that. So Bob said, "Look, I'd like to tell everybody, go home. You don't have to do this, but I can't. I have to ask you to go." But he said, "I can't take the whole responsibility. You got to decide. And there's no shame if you can't go, it's fine." Utter silence in the room. I sink into my chair just like everybody else. And you start asking yourself, what in the hell are you doing there? Is this what I bought? My father's a rabbi. My mother was a teacher. We lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War, when a lot of his work was with Holocaust survivors. My 5th birthday party was in what was called a DP camp of all children, where I was supposed to give gifts rather than getting them. And I thought all children was cool until I understood why the parents were gone. So it was a reality in our home, but my parents interpreted the Holocaust to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism, and that racism kills. You know, it turned people into objects. You can do anything. You know, as a rabbi's kid, I don't know if there's any preacher's kids or whatever, you're supposed to go to all the religious stuff, and you're also supposed to be perfect, which is another set of issues. But I did love the telling of the Exodus story with food at a Passover Seder. And there would be a point where they would point to the children and say, you were slaves in Egypt. I said, excuse me, I've never been a slave, never been to Egypt. And so I realized that that story was not the property of one people or time or place. It's told generation after generation. You got to figure with the guys with the horses and the chariots or with the people trying to find their way to land of promise. And, you know, looking around the room, I was 20 at that time. Others were 21, 22, 18, 19. It was a movement of young people. It was a movement of young people. There's a Protestant theologian who wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination. And he says, transformational vision occurs at the intersection of two things. One he calls criticality, a clear view of the world's pain, of its hurt, of its need, coupled with hope, a sense of the world's promise and possibilities. And young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, as you know, but also almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. So there's a deep affinity between generation change and social change. That's how it was for my generation, and I think that's how it is for your generation, in the way we're seeing it. As we're sitting there in silence, a young woman named Jean Wheeler stands up in the back. She starts to sing. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we struggled so long, we must be free. They say freedom is a constant dying. We've died too long, we must be free. And as she stood up to walk out of the room, everybody followed in behind her and everybody went to Mississippi. Now, that for me was when my education about race, power, and politics began, with all due respect to Harvard, because the inequalities were so clear. You know, everything, housing, healthcare, education, whites up here, blacks down here. And it was also clear that bringing a few books or medical supplies wasn't going to do much. The person who brought it would feel good. It's when I learned the difference between charity and justice. Charity says, what's wrong? Let me help. Justice says, why is it happening? Let me change it. And when you ask those questions, then you begin to get pushback, because it is often the case that these people do not have enough because these people have too much. And so you start trying to rearrange that and you got a problem. And what we found was that dealing with that problem was simply not happening unless the people with the problem could become agents of its solution. And we all learned that from the Montgomery bus boycott. Everybody knows about Rosa Parks, right? The lady who one day got tired and wouldn't give her seat up on the segregated bus. Actually, she was an organizer. She was secretary of the NAACP chapter. She'd been trained an organizer in Highlander School. It was all a strategy. And it was a strategy intending to get her arrested to challenge the constitutionality of segregated buses based on Brown v. Board of Education the year before. Now, what happened though, the Women's Committee at the Black College said, wait a second, we have to show some solidarity. We can't let her go to jail by herself. And so they asked Dr. King and the others to ask everybody to stay off the buses one day. And you know, there's this great story of Monday morning, Dr. King gets up, he looks at the buses going by, there isn't a single black face on a single bus. At that moment, that community saw itself differently, because powerlessness fragments you and unity can empower you. And so it was that night they decided that they discovered that they had resources. Everybody had resources because everybody had feet. And if they used their feet to walk to work and deny the bus company their bus fare, instead of using their feet to get on the bus and give the bus company their bus fare, then their dependency on the bus company would turn into its dependency on them. Individual resources could then become collective power. And that's at the heart of what organizing is all about, is how to make that shift. Well, I got hooked on that. I didn't go back to school to finish my senior year. It felt like we were making history. Why could I go back and study history? See, I actually wrote him a letter that said that was kind of arrogant, but also was true. I went back to Bakersfield, California, where I grew up. It's an oil and agriculture town. Cesar Chavez had just started a great strike among migrant farm workers. I'd grown up in that world. I hadn't seen it. I had to go to Mississippi and get what we called Mississippi eyes to come back and see another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections, and California with its own rich history of racial discrimination going back to the native peoples, the Chinese, the Japanese, and so forth. So it turned out Mississippi was not an exception to America. It was an example of the America we needed to change. So I worked with Cesar for the next 16 years, which is really where I learned the craft of organizing. I left in 1981, did another 10 years of union mostly union and electoral organizing in California. and then was invited to my 25th reunion here at Harvard, even though I never graduated. It surprised me because I had not started a software company up in Seattle that would explain why they might invite me. But I was feeling stuck. Reagan had been president for 8 years. And I went, and it was like running into 20-year-old me who was saying, how's it going? I was saying, well, I don't know, I'm stuck. And so 20-year-old me said, well, come back and finish that senior year. So I don't know, the synapses, they're not working. And I don't know, the tuition had changed a little bit. But we figured it out. So in 1991, I came back, finished my senior year, wrote a senior thesis in history and government, and graduated class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son Folly become a college graduate. Well, I got the bug, then did a master's at the Kennedy School, a PhD in sociology, and while working on the PhD was asked to design a class on organizing. That was a gift to me, because it was the way I could connect life experience with the social science I was learning in a pedagogical conversation with a rising generation. It was like, hey, you get to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. How cool is that? For my learning, for everyone's learning. So I've been on the faculty full-time since 2000. I teach organizing online and offline in the spring, and I teach public narrative online and offline in the fall, and got back into the world of action mainly through my students with Howard Dean's campaign in 2003, with the Obama campaign in 2007, and since then working with people in many different parts of the world who are trying to figure out how they can turn their values into the sources of power that they need in order to create a future into which they can and want to raise their children and their families and live. So this framework that I just shared with you, it's a work in progress. It's a constant effort to learn from practice and, learn and, oh, this, we'll adapt that. And what we found is extraordinarily portable. People tell stories in Jordan, they tell stories in Japan, they tell stories in Kenya. And that as a foundation enables you to find where common ground is in order to work together and work more effectively in your own communities. So that's sort of my wrap, I guess. It was lecture-y, I'm sorry about that. We really need to have interaction, questions, and so forth. I'm going to turn it over to Anjali at this point, because what we'd like to, well, Anjali will explain. Go ahead.
Thank you, Marshall. So hi, everyone. In 15 minutes or so, we'll have a second session with me where we really focus on story of now. I know you did some work on story of self, I think last week. We want to take these next 9 minutes to hear from you, specifically 2 things. So I'm going to ask that people actually share this in the chat, and then we'll have a few people that Marshall will get to talk to. So one is based on what Marshall just shared, a key takeaway that you have about organizing. That can also be a question. The second piece is we want to hear from you what the biggest challenges you're facing are right now in the organizing work you're doing or the leadership work you're doing.
Right.
So if you could take maybe a minute to put those in the chat, and then we're going to call in a few people to hear in more depth what these challenges are.
We got enough, Anjali?
Not yet. We're going to take another 45 seconds, folks. No rush, but we'd love to hear from you that second piece as well, the specific challenges you're facing.
The intent here is not simply to be informative, but to be helpful. And for that, we need to know what the challenges are.
So, Marshall, I'm going to share one challenge that I think would be interesting to engage with here. So, Taji, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Taji, can you say something so I can see you?
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. Yeah, you want me to elaborate more on what I was mentioning?
Could you share it with us? And then, yes, if you want to elaborate, that would be great.
Sure. So I wrote, sorry, it was maybe a little messier than I wanted it to be, but I want to make sure I could get it out there first. So I wrote, the biggest challenge I'm facing is the polarizing nature of folks who want to engage within the system versus those outside of the system, more grassroots. How can we create substantive change and navigate these systems while also trying to avoid bureaucratic fodder and inaction? And I guess that really stemmed, oh, my camera went away. I guess that really stemmed out of a lot of the work I'm doing around criminal justice and policing that I've done for the last 4 or 5 years now.
Can you
navigate that.
Can you cite a specific?
Yeah, I would say people talking about, I guess, this concept of abolition in regards to police reform is created.
Taji, which people?
Are you talking about the people who are advocating for abolition?
I'm asking you, what I'm asking you is to be very, very specific about what you're referring to so we don't get lost in abstraction.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So I would say a lot of Black and brown communities are advocating for abolition because they do not believe that the system of policing in its origin is built on anything more than white supremacy and systemic racism, and that in order to live in a more just and equal society, we have to strip the system, and not necessarily through the idea of like getting rid of it right away, but like steps towards that, I guess, which is this idea of divestment.
How does this play out the work you're actually doing? Manifest. Yeah.
A lot of it has to do with the work I do with my nonprofit, which talks about training and policy advocacy work. And so we're trying to navigate if it's best to do it in the sense of this grassroots work, which is more focused on protests and folks who are doing day-to-day, wanting to like see a lot of action versus those who want to see action from within. So navigating, working with leadership and elected officials to try to move some of the stuff there. And if it should be a mix of the two, or if there's benefits to one or the other.
Marshall, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Taji, before we go deeper, that question of who are my people, how would you answer that as an organizer? Who are your people that you're primarily working with or wanting to work with?
Yeah. Are you talking about like the people that work? So, I mean, I do a lot of work with Black and brown young people. Those are the organizers I do work with, and a lot of folks that work with my organization. And then there's also, I guess, those are my people. And there's the people we work with, which is not those populations or demographics.
Yeah, I asked the question, I'll pass it back to you, Marshall.
No, go ahead.
One concept that we teach with Marshall's framework is when do we bound in versus when do we bound out with our us's? So a question I'd have for you is, do you feel strong in the leadership you've built in your current us before bounding out to this larger us? And Marshall, I know you were about to ask something too.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Respond to Angela if you can, Taji.
Yeah, I guess I would say, yes, I feel very secure in the leadership and the people who work with this us idea. And I feel like there's a strong push right now for that. But at the same time, like, how do we measure outcomes, I guess, when you have to try to do that work outside of working with them? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Marshall,
go ahead, Angela. You're on a roll there.
I guess I'm wondering, you said you feel secure, you feel good about the work. What does that mean? Like, what do you see in your leadership? What campaigns have you won? Like, I'm trying to see it more clearly.
Yeah, I would say because of this large push that's really been out of the last 3 months, there's a lot of individuals on the other side listening. And I would say that is a good indicator of success in our work. And at the same time, it isn't, because they're just listening and not moving things forward. So it's really a difficult space that I'm not trying to navigate. And then at the same time, it has a lot of connection to a lot of the other stuff. And we're talking generally like voting. And that was the question I was positing to Cliff last week around how do we look at a city, I live in Oregon, and how do we look at like a very progressive city like that, who cares about action, but then isn't voting, those sorts of things. And they're not trusting those systems. So it's like, how do you work within or against or for or all of that towards something that's, what we call this philosophical change or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'd like to share with you that we can also share with this group as a resource, I actually am just coming from a workshop where we ran through building your strategy. And there's a process that we go through with really focusing in on who are my people, what is their lived experience of the problem, how would the world look different if their problem were solved, and what would be one step towards that. And the steps we go through after is determining what would be the first strategic goal in that campaign, What are the resources that our current us has that we can use in new ways? What I'm hearing in your, and I know we could go in a lot more depth, I'm hearing that there's a lot of strength in the group you already have. I'm wondering what clarifying a strategy that both continues to build and then shifts power in a way that works to your benefit. I think going through that kind of process could maybe be helpful, because it also helps make decisions about when do we want to put the pressure on who, what's our strategy for when and how do we want to do a protest, do we want to do negative press? But going through that kind of process, I think, can be very helpful with making those decisions. Marshall.
So let me just interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just that
no, go ahead.
We are at 5:40 and the next
geez.
session begins at 5:45. It's another Zoom link and we really need to stay on time. That's our commitment to the participants. So if you, Marshall or Anjali, if you have a couple of quick final words, that would be wonderful. And I also just want to say something about the next session.
I guess the question is, are the same people going to be on the thing in 15 minutes?
Almost all of them will be in the same.
Because then we can continue the conversation. And I think Anjali is going to facilitate that part.
Yeah.
But just to say,
it starts in 3 minutes. That's the reason I'm rushing. So.
Okay. Well, then we can just wait, and then we'll start in 3 minutes.
Okay, great. You can wait.
Thank you, Taji, for sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, there's a little more follow-up there to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
I also just wanted to tell everybody who cannot join the next, is not joining us in a few minutes, that we are having a session next Tuesday, and I'm delighted that Mark McKinnon, who is a chief media advisor for George Bush, a communications director for George Bush, and Jennifer Palmieri, who is a communications director for Barack Obama and for Hillary Clinton, will be joining us about messaging in political campaigns. So I'm excited about that. And I'll see you all in a couple of minutes, but big thanks to Marshall and Anjali, and see you in a couple of minutes.